Mass Effect Legendary Edition has been out for a month now, and many players are either on to the finale of the Mass Effect trilogy or perhaps even starting a second playthrough already. So it's about time to start going over the best strategies for Mass Effect 3 Legendary Edition on Insanity difficulty. If you're new to ME3's combat or just having to readjust yet again after coming off of ME2's combat, you're in the right place, because today we're going over 6 tips that will make you an absolute master of Mass Effect 3's very deep and sometimes complex combat system. These tips are geared for Insanity difficulty, but even at lower difficulty settings, you'll get great use out of these strategies. And with that, let's jump right into tip number 1. 1. Chain together and layer combo detonations. Power combo detonations are great, but more advanced combo detonation chains are even better. You probably already know about combo detonations, but did you know that you can chain together detonations to deal even more damage? Power combo detonations happen when one power primes an enemy, like setting them on fire for instance, and a second power detonates them, for instance, an overload ability that deals damage, but also combines with the existing fire damage from Incinerate to trigger a tech explosion. But some abilities like Lash and Warp can act as both a primer and a detonator at the same time. This is incredibly useful to know because once you figure this out, you can stack your squad's attacks in a specific order that allow you to prime, detonate, prime in quick succession. For example, if you use Incinerate on an enemy, they'll be primed for a tech detonation. This can be detonated by the biotic ability Warp, triggering a fiery explosion, but at the same time, Warp primes the target for a biotic detonation, which you can then trigger with another ability like Throw. This results in 2 combo detonations as a result of 3 powers being used instead of 4, saving you time and increasing your squad's overall DPS. I recommend sticking with Warp as your prime detonate middle power, but depending on certain situations you can use other abilities. Reeve, for instance, can prime and detonate with other biotic abilities, but won't detonate tech abilities. Lash can prime and detonate, but that's only available as a bonus power after playing the Omega DLC, so your best bet and most easily accessible option is going to be Warp. Overload and Incinerate both work great as initial setup powers, and for the second detonator, feel free to use any number of damage dealing abilities. In addition to chaining together combo detonations, you can also layer them. Layering priming abilities is simply a matter of using 2 different types of priming abilities, one right after the other. You see, there are 4 types of primers: biotic, tech, fire, and cryo, with fire and cryo being specific types of tech primers. Any enemy in the game can be primed with any number of primers, but not more than 1 of each type at a time, meaning that you can use Warp to prime an enemy for a biotic combo, then you can use Incinerate to prime them for a fire combo, then use Throw to detonate the fire explosion, then use Throw again after the cooldown or another biotic power to detonate the biotic explosion. Same amount of overall powers, but depending on which of your detonators are on cooldown, you can save time by setting up multiple primers at once. Combo detonations are the most powerful damage dealing ability and AoE ability in the game, and you should really be building your entire squad strategy around them in Mass Effect 3. If done correctly, you should rarely even ever have to fire a shot from your own gun. For this reason, I highly recommend using chain detonations whenever possible, but also working in some multiple primer layers when needed. And with all this talk about priming and detonating and power usage, it should come as no surprise that our second tip is number 2, always have plus 200% maxed out cooldown reduction based on your weapon loadout. I know soldiers and infiltrators might take issue with this approach, but after more than a dozen playthroughs of ME3, including multiple successful runs on Insanity, I can tell you without a shred of doubt that combo detonations are completely OP, and unless you're trying to make the game more challenging for yourself, you should structure your entire strategy around them. Which means you need to use lots of powers and use them quickly. The entire goal should be to maximize the amount of detonations that you can trigger, which means in addition to tip number 1 about prime detonate chains, you need very low cooldown times on all of your abilities. In ME3, that cooldown time can be heavily influenced by what weapons you bring into battle. Depending on which weapons you use and how many you take with you, your powers can recharge faster or slower than they normally would. The more weapons you bring and the heavier those weapons are, the more your power usage will be slowed, but at the opposite end of that, if you bring very few weapons and stick to lighter weight weapons, you can have a maximum of plus 200% cooldown reduction which is a massive advantage. In order to achieve a plus 200% cooldown reduction, you may need to take different steps based on your character's class and which skill trees you've upgraded, but in general, try to stick to only 1 or 2 weapons, avoid sniper rifles and shotguns, which are generally heavier, and use the lightest assault rifle or pistol available, and always install ultralight material upgrades when available. If you really want to use a sniper rifle or a shotgun, go with a single weapon loadout, choose the lightest model available, and definitely have ultralight materials on hand. Also key to this strategy is to take skill tree upgrades that increase your overall weapon weight capacity. The 200% cooldown bonus is calculated based off of your overall capacity, so if you're under a certain threshold of overall capacity, you qualify for the highest bonus cooldown reduction. Simply put, increasing overall weapon weight capacity makes it easier for you to carry your heavier loadouts while still getting the max cooldown reduction bonus. Depending on your class, keep an eye out for skill tree upgrades that offer this bonus. And speaking of leveling up, that brings us to tip number 3. 3. Always take every cooldown reduction upgrade in skill trees unless you already have an effective cooldown of less than 2 seconds. If you're starting to notice a theme here, that's a good thing because it should be setting in by now. Using powers and triggering combo detonations is the whole game. Everything should feed into that. We've already covered how to get bonus cooldown reduction from weapon loadout, but the base cooldown time also depends on each individual power and how you've upgraded it, as well as class skill tree bonuses. Every skill tree in Mass Effect 3 has 6 levels to it, with the first 3 being totally linear and the last 3 allowing you to choose which upgrade to take. Let me be perfectly clear here, almost any time you get a choice in which upgrade to take the one that gives a cooldown reduction. Whatever else you have to pass up, in almost every case, it's worth it to get a shorter cooldown. Damage bonus, duration bonus, power radius, health and shields, none of these generally help you as much as cooldown reduction will for this strategy in mind. The only 2 exceptions to this are increasing your detonation damage and radius, and if you find yourself in a situation where you already have an effective cooldown rate of less than 2 seconds on a particular power. Increasing detonation damage and radius plays into the higher level strategy that we're going for of maximizing DPS through detonations, and in the case of the second exception, if a particular power can be used in less than 2 seconds, you're pretty much good to go from there. Remember, whatever is listed as the cooldown time of a power in its skill tree is not going to be the effective cooldown time if you followed my other tip in order to achieve maximum weapon loadout cooldown reduction. If in combat you're able to continually use a power with near instant cooldown, you can stop taking cooldown upgrades for that power specifically. The main example that I would offer of this is the biotic ability Throw while playing as the Sentinel. While playing as the Sentinel, I took every cooldown upgrade that I could in the class skill tree and most of them in the ability skill tree. But by the time I got to the final upgrade for Throw, I just didn't need it to be any faster when factoring in my cooldown reduction bonus from having a lighter weapon loadout. I'm going to include some combat footage from an Insanity playthrough that you can see playing in the background right now that gives you a good idea of just how fast Throw can finish its cooldown. Keep in mind that this is without the final upgrade for recharge time. As you can see, despite the fact that there are tons of husks coming after me, I have no problem crowd controlling all of them essentially by myself. You have to remember that it takes about a half second for the power projectile to reach the enemy, and maybe it takes you another half second to identify and aim for the next target, which leaves you probably less than a second of waiting time before you can fire off the next power. So while I could technically make Throw's cooldown even shorter, you can see in this video, enemies aren't even getting close to me thanks to how fast I can use powers already. And speaking of using Throw while playing as a Sentinel, let's talk about tip number 4. 4. Play as a Sentinel. No, seriously, just play as a Sentinel. Throughout my tips videos for Mass Effect Legendary Edition, I've tried to stay away from making any of the tips class specific. But for this one, I just had to make it as straightforward as possible. I think that based on the strategy that I'm laying out, Sentinel is the way to go. While it's true that these tips could work with any class, especially because you're also using your squad to produce combo detonations, I think that Sentinel is best suited to this strategy for a few reasons. First is that Sentinel has multiple ways to achieve its own combos and combo chains without any help and without having to go deep into an abilities upgrade tree. Cryoblast Warp Throw, or Overload Warp Throw, or even Lift Grenade Warp Throw all make great combo detonation chains, and you have access to multiple kinds of combos also, so Tech, Cryo, and Biotic. And because you have so many tech and biotic powers, you can pull off one of the coolest chains in ME3, which is Cryoblast, Overload, Warp, Throw. Overload detonates Cryoblast and primes again, which is detonated by Warp, which primes once again, which is detonated by Throw. That's a whopping 3 combo detonations triggered by just 4 powers. Now, there are other classes capable of pulling off incredible combo chains. For a long time, Adept was my favorite class in ME3 because of how many combos it could pull off. But that always came at the expense of things like durability and weapon weight capacity, which does affect the combo detonation strategy. You see, Adept has the lowest overall weapon weight capacity in Mass Effect 3, which means, if you recall from our earlier tips, that it becomes slightly harder to achieve a maximum plus 200% cooldown reduction. You often end up having to only take a pistol into battle or a very light assault rifle with ultralight materials, and even though it's a powers/combo based strategy, you will need weapons at some point in between power usage or against specific enemies. But moreover, Sentinel also has the Tech Armor ability, which adds an additional layer of damage protection. Classes like Adept can compare favorably to Sentinel when it comes to power usage, but not survivability, which on Insanity especially can be a challenge if you're not careful. And if you're worried about the cooldown penalties that come from Tech Armor, remember that when it's fully upgraded, it's only a 20% penalty, easily overshadowed by gains from weapon loadout and elsewhere. And on top of that, Sentinel comes with other advantages like a fitness tree upgrade that adds a significant plus 30% to health and shields for squad mates. That's a big deal because it could allow you to skip a health and shields upgrade for a squad mate in their own trees in favor of a powers or weapons upgrade. And speaking of squad mate skill trees, let's talk about tip number 5. 5. Always fully upgrade squad mate class trees and your own class skill tree first. This should come as no surprise by now, but you want to prioritize survivability and passive boosts to power usage, and class skill trees, both for your own character and squad mates, are the fastest way to do that. The first 3 upgrades in any class skill tree are essential to health, shields, and either weapon or power bonuses. They're essentially must-have. Not immediately taking those first 3 upgrades will only lead to misery and frustration, and your squad will be far too squishy, lacking the necessary health and shields to compete in just about any fight. But even beyond those first 3 ranks, you really need to fully upgrade the class skill trees to get the full effect. Abilities are great, and obviously you do need to unlock and upgrade specific powers to use, but especially early on, make sure you max out the passive bonuses first. Then, as you progress, you can start to unlock more fancy moves to use. Each class skill tree is slightly different, and this is not a build video, so I'm not going to go into too many specific choices here. Just make sure that you fully upgrade the skill tree at the bottom of the level up screen for each character as soon as you possibly can. The one and only exception to this is Liara. Her class tree is pure biotic, and I don't think she absolutely needs rank 5 and rank 6 from those upgrades right away. Certainly they're useful and you'll probably want to get them later on, but the priority for Liara should be fully upgrading Stasis into the rank 6 form Stasis Bubble, getting at least rank 4 of Pure Biotic, and then putting remaining points into Warp and Singularity. Other than that, every squad mate should have their class skill tree upgraded fully right away. This is a simple tip, but it can make a world of difference, especially in the early and mid game. And finally, we have tip number 6. Bring someone with Overload and upgrade it so that it chains to extra enemies. Overload is one of my favorite abilities across the entire trilogy because it's one of the most useful and one of the most used abilities you'll find yourself relying upon as you save the galaxy. In ME3 especially, it continues as the primary way to drop shields, becomes the go-to attack against barriers also, and becomes a fairly decent crowd control ability when used properly. Overload, of course, will damage and drop enemy shields, but it also staggers unprotected enemies in addition to dealing damage to health, and if you take the 2 optional chain upgrades, Overload will strike up to 2 additional enemies near the primary target. Furthermore, if you take the rank 5 upgrade for Neural Shock, it will also knock out weaker enemies for a second or 2, but this actually leaves them vulnerable for a couple of more seconds while they pick themselves up from their impromptu dirt nap. If you're trying to master crowd control, it can be especially satisfying to see 3 enemies drop to the ground like a sack of Cerberus potatoes. I don't even know what that means. You know what? I wrote it already, may as well just go with it. Drop to the ground like a sack of Cerberus potatoes, and then proceed to shoot or detonate the hell out of them after that. If you decide to follow tip number 4, you'll be able to do this yourself as a Sentinel, but if not, Garrus, Caden, or Edie can all serve as the squad's resident overload master. And so, that's it. 6 tips that you can use to turn Insanity difficulty in Mass Effect 3 Legendary Edition into easy mode. If you like this video, please consider hitting the like button, and if you'd like to be informed of all future videos, please consider hitting the subscribe button and the bell notification icon. I have had an absolute blast making videos, tips videos for Mass Effect Legendary Edition, and there's still more to share. I've played Mass Effect a lot over the years, so there's still more in terms of class-specific builds, strategies for squad mates, etc. Please leave a comment down below and let me know which game and which aspect of the trilogy you'd like for me to cover next. I appreciate your time and support, and as always, thanks for watching, and thank you for listening.